Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel where we sometimes talk about thrillers and horror novels on Thursdays. And first I wanted to say a big thank you for all of the wonderful comments and discussion on my last video where I was talking about horror novels by Black authors. I will be starting to review a lot of those books very soon, but first I don't want to say get out of the way because that doesn't sound great, but I did kind of want to get this review out of the way of a book I read back at the start of quarantine because I have a lot of thoughts on it and I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. And as you can tell from the title and thumbnail, today we are going to be talking about Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo with no spoilers. Now this is my first time reading Leigh Bardugo. You all, in fact, I'm sure are much more versed on her than I. I have not read Six of Crows, Shadow and Bone, any of those. And I have to say, I was really excited going into this because I would always see people on book Twitter talking about Leigh Bardugo and her books, and I always felt a little bit left out just because I frankly have not been very interested in her other books. But then one of my good friends, Jenna, said that Ninth House was her favorite book of the year, and she told me that I had to check this out because she loved it so much. And on top of that, this is Leigh Bardugo's first adult book. It's supposed to be very dark. I mainly read dark adult fiction, so I thought, perfect, this is my perfect entrance into the Leigh Bardugo world. Wrong. As I said, this video will contain no spoilers, but we're going to go through a very high-level summary and then we'll get into my thoughts. Our protagonist of Ninth House is Galaxy Stern. She's 20 years old and has had a very difficult life, and I will just say up front, warnings going into this book: if you do not want to read any material related to drug abuse, sexual abuse, anything in that realm, this book deals with a lot of very, very heavy, dark topics. So she has had a very difficult life. She does not come from money, and she is able to see through the veil and see grays, which are more or less kind of ghosts. And what we learn is that Yale has these secret societies, and her ability to see grays is actually incredibly special. Most of the people performing magic at Yale in these secret societies are not able to just innately, naturally do so. So when they find out she's able to, even though she hasn't, finished high school or anything like that, they kind of just plop and pull her in because of this ability and bring her to Yale, where she is trained by her mentor named Darlington. Now let's go ahead and get into my thoughts. First, let's talk about the pacing, because this was likely some of the strangest pacing I've ever read in a book before. If you take a look at Goodreads reviews on this, one thing you'll see a lot of people saying, and I heard this as well, my friend who recommended me this book told me this up front, because I did tell her, I said, the beginning's a little strange, I'm having trouble getting into it, and she said you just have to get through the first 100 pages and then it really picks up and it's smooth sailing. Now in my opinion, I thought that in fact 90% of the book was incredibly slow, and 10% of the time there were these little pockets dispersed throughout. Yes, a little bit more so at the end, but not necessarily, where the pace picked up a little bit. The book starts in sort of present day when something horrific is happening to Galaxy at the school, and then it goes back slightly to just before that when Galaxy is trying to figure things out on her own. All you know is that Darlington is missing and you don't know why. And then it also is vacillating back and forth between Darlington's perspective when he's first bringing Galaxy on board and training her. Now, I don't necessarily mind dual perspectives and timelines. One of my favorite books of all time is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, and I think this book handles that type of pacing incredibly well. And it works well in this case because you're vacillating between forward and backward in time. This is a crime novel, in case you're curious, and you know that a horrific murder is going to happen at the climax. And so because of that, and these dual perspectives at different points in times of before and after the murder, it builds up the attention to an incredible degree. Now, some people might consider what I'm about to say a spoiler. I personally don't think it is, but just a mini heads up. The main crux of tension that I think Leigh Bardugo is trying to build out throughout this series is that in present day Darlington is missing and you don't know why. So when you're going back and forth between Darlington's perspective in the past, Galaxy's in present day, I think she wants you to feel nervous wondering, okay, what happened to Darlington? But, and again, this is the part where it might be a little bit spoilery, but again, I don't think so. Anyone who's reading this book and is aware it's a series, and you can tell how much Leigh Bardugo wants you to fall in love with Darlington. I was never nervous whether it's in this book or whether it's maybe down the road in one of her future books, because this is a series. I don't think there's ever any question, even though she's trying to lead us to believe it, that Darlington will not be back. That's just not a worry I ever had. So for me, I didn't feel any tension built up at all throughout the book. I won't say if it happens in this book, but I just kept thinking, there's no way we're not going to see Darlington again. I'm not worried about it. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this book is marketed as a dark adult fantasy, and I have a little bit of issues with those last two adjectives. To me, first talking about the fantasy piece, to me at least, even though this is marketed as a fantasy, although there are a lot of fantasy elements, in my opinion, much of this book ended up feeling a lot more like a crime detective novel, and I should say the vast majority of books I read fall within that realm of dark crime, detective, anything in that realm, and I thought that piece of this book, and just for context, there's a girl who's murdered and Galaxy's trying to figure it out, and there's another crime in the past she's trying to figure out. I found those sections incredibly dull. There's nothing particularly thrilling. There aren't interesting clues and pieces necessarily that I found she was really putting together, and this is the one place where I will say, you know, I haven't read Leigh Bardugo before. I don't read a lot of fantasy, but since I do read so many crime novels, I will say that in my opinion, even though it's my opinion, I think that section of the book was objectively pretty poorly handled in comparison to the other books I read. These next two pieces, I'm really curious about your takes, particularly from those of you who read a lot of fantasy or who read a lot of young adult novels. I really felt that because this book is set at Yale, it really took away from the immersion and excitement of falling into a fantasy world. At first I was wondering, why is this set up with Yale and these secret societies? And then I did some Googling and I quickly realized that Leigh Bardugo went to Yale. She was part of one of these secret societies, and I might be the outlier here, maybe for some of you, and again, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Maybe that really helped you fall into this world, because many of us, including myself, although I didn't go to Yale, I've been to New Haven before, so for some of you, it might have made it much easier and exciting to fall into that fantasy world. For me, it took all of the excitement out of it, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I think if you had gone to Yale, then this would increase your excitement about reading the book. But as someone who has never been to Yale, I don't have a huge interest in the secret societies that are real and at Yale. It just kept taking me out of the book and didn't fill me with that excitement that I normally have when I sometimes read a fantasy novel. I also felt that, and maybe this was just with the timelines, when you end up learning at the end about these secret societies, it's really not incredibly complex, but somehow I feel as if she managed to make it feel very convoluted. And I think part of that, and this is me skipping ahead a little bit to talk about characters, there were so many characters thrown in, and aside from Galaxy and Darlington, I was not incredibly interested in any of them. You know, there's the side character who's quiet, that's her defining personality, who works with Galaxy and Darlington. I cannot recall most of the villains' names off the top of my head. Granted, I read this over a month ago, but needless to say, no one really stuck with me aside from Galaxy and Darlington, who at the end of the day, I thought both of those characters were fine, but both felt like carbon copies of characters I've read in other books. Now I want to talk a little bit about this being marketed as an adult novel. As I said, I was so excited about the fact she's coming out with an adult novel, because you guys know I love thrillers, I love horror, I love anything with darker elements, and that's why I tend to read adult more so. It's not because I think adult novels inherently have better writing by any stretch of the imagination. This is going to be a very stupid question, and I'm honestly asking it to you all, but does new adult not exist anymore? Because in my opinion, this book fits perfectly into new adult. Because if you handed me this book, and this is going to sound odd because it does have so many dark themes, so many graphic elements, but if you gave me this book and didn't tell me if it was young adult, didn't tell me if it was adult, didn't tell me it was written by Leigh Bardugo, I would have immediately assumed that it was new adult. But it definitely does not feel like an adult novel in my opinion, even though it is very dark, and it also doesn't feel like young adult. And I think part of that comes from the fact that it has a lot of tropes that you would see in young adult books about how Galaxy just naturally is this super powerful outlier. I'm blanking on what the specific name of that trope is, but you see it a lot in YA. Also, her views on adults and the way adults were treated in the book felt a lot like what you read in young adult novels. So again, that's not a criticism of the book, but I just find it strange, even though it did have those dark elements, that was marketed as an adult book. So those are all of my thoughts on Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. At the end of the day, I enjoyed her writing style for the most part, which I completely forgot to touch on in this book, even though I thought some sections were really overwritten. You know what, I just need to stop. But by no means am I not going to pick up a Leigh Bardugo book in the future simply because I didn't enjoy this one. But again, please let me know your thoughts. Did you completely disagree with me on this? Because most of the reviews on Goodreads are 5 stars, so people really, really love this. Again, I hope you guys like this video. I hope you're doing okay, and if you haven't had a chance yet, please go ahead and check out my video that will be linked at the end where I talk about horror novels by Black authors, because any money made from that video I will be donating to the Loveland Foundation. Again, I hope you guys are having a good one, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.